Chef Mazi is he's working on a book that focuses on elevating the profile of mushrooms in cooking. He thinks, and I probably agree, that it doesn't get enough attention in a lot of the general cookbooks. I have a few specialty mushroom cookbooks, but I'm on the other hand, I've pulled some cookbooks that just really have no mushroom recipes at all, and certainly don't deal with the different kinds of mushrooms that we find out in the woods. Um, Zachary is also on Patreon, and he's working on a book that will focus specifically on mushrooms. You can find the information about that in our full description of this event if you want to support him on Patreon. I don't know a lot about Patreon, but my sense is it's kind of crowdsourced funding for somebody who really wants to devote themselves to a particular project. And this one sounds like a really worthy project. Zachary, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you got?
Yeah, I will. I was just going to add another slide, but you know what? I'll just do that one at the end. So as you said, my name is Zachary. I'm from originally Eugene, Oregon. I did a really 6-year stint in Santa Cruz, California, which is where I connected with the Soma mycology group up in Sonoma, California, and that's really what kind of brought me into the fold of the fungus groups. And since then, I've been sort of following this track on edible mushrooms and science, which is, for me, cooking and science is really like my main intersection. Actually, before I get started, in the chat, I just put in all my info. So if you guys want to send me emails or find me on Instagram, website, everything's right there in the chat. And this is I guess this talk is trying to speak for the mushrooms themselves. Like, how would the mushrooms feel if they knew how neglected they'd been in our cookbooks? So I'm calling this Erecting the Third Culinary Kingdom, a fungi-centric review of cooking literature, past, present, and future. Future has not been written yet, which is exciting. Some of us are trying to write it as we speak. So, well, first of all, what in the world is a kingdom? I think most of us are aware that the fungi, plants, and animals, at the very least, are quite different from each other, right? So there are 5 or 6 kingdoms, depending on whom you ask. And what I'd like to define is a culinary kingdom. So what in the world is a culinary kingdom? Well, we know veggies, right? We know meat, and we know fungi. And yet cookbooks don't separate their information in this way at all. In fact, it's basically you have a meat section and a veggie section, and that's it. And for far too long, fungi have ended up in the veggie section. Now, when I was doing this, I had to laugh because, as it turns out, there's also seaweed, which is in the algae, is the different ferments, which use Lactobacillus, which is even yet another kingdom. So this may be the beginning of actually including all of the culinary kingdoms in cooking. But for now, let's focus on fungus. And then, of course, why does it matter, right? What's the point? Well, first of all, let's back up a little bit. So there are carnivores, and carnivores can exist by solely eating organisms that come from the kingdom Animalia. And so, this was a cat in Thailand. I think last time I spoke to you guys, I was in Thailand. That was some time ago. Yeah, we just celebrated our 6 month back from Thailand. This is a cute kitten on our property. But so carnivores eat only meat and can eat only meat and aren't limited to being in the kingdom Animalia themselves. Actually, a Venus flytrap is also a carnivore, as are some parasitic fungi and some other creatures. There are herbivores. Herbivores exist eating only kingdom plantae, and a lot of the herd animals. This is a water buffalo from Thailand. A lot of the herd animals, guinea pigs, rabbits, kangaroos, koalas, these are all herbivores, right? As it turns out, they're also fungivores. There are some larger ones, but I wanted to put the most familiar one to most of us there on the screen. Mostly they're larvae. The fungivores are other fungi or insect larvae. There are some rare exceptions of some small primates that eat the bulk of their sustenance in mushrooms during the rainy season. But so there's a lot of things that eat mushrooms. There's very few actual fungivores, but it's important to study this stuff. So mycophagy, or mycophagy book, is as John was referring to, is something I'm trying to put down. And the more that I study, the bigger this project becomes. And I'm thinking it may actually need to become an institute. And I'll talk a little bit about that and the changing sort of viewpoint at the end of this talk. So what is mycophagy? Mycophagy is the eating of mushrooms. That's in cookery, or the use of mushroom fungi as a source of nutrients. You know, we've gone a little bit beyond just searching for nutrients when we're eating, right? So I started, my interest was, what is the medicinal qualities of edible mushrooms? Because we heard a lot about medicinal or functional mushrooms, and people are like, oh, I don't really know how to get in that. But if they knew that the shiitake was really medicinal, that kind of got me into this. Well, what are the chemical properties of these edible mushrooms that we have? And why don't we know more about that, or why isn't that shared? And lastly, of course, there's omnivores, which is us. An omnivore is any organism that utilizes more than one of the above kingdoms, right? And so humans, dogs, foxes, raccoons, many insects, we eat across the board. And so I think it's important to look at the ways that humans have cooked and to establish why the kingdoms are important and why it's important to designate the three, at least for me, the three kingdoms rather than just the two. So humans in cooking is maybe as old as humans at all. If you haven't read it, Catching Fire, a book by Richard Wrangham, he lays out a very, very passionate and well-researched theory that it was in fact the externalization of fire that allowed the Australopithecines to turn into the very early Homo line that we have now become. That so many of the things that we do internally, or we did internally as the great apes, such as the digestion, the chewing, all of this, that can be done with fire. And so whereas apes have to spend up to 8 hours sitting in one place chewing leaves to get all the calories they need, with fire you can suddenly get 2,500 calories in a half an hour. You know, it renders root vegetables edible, it renders barks edible, it makes hard to digest leaves and plants edible, not to mention meats safe to eat, and it allows us even to go out on multi-day forays. The book is fantastic. I highly recommend reading it. But what's fascinating is it means that cooking is 1.9 million years old. You know, a lot of people sort of put fire in the wheel at similar times in invention, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it was fire that became us. And so our relationship to cooking, our relationship to food, is almost as intrinsic as our relationship to our own mothers. We come from that history. And up until just recently, and Michael Pollan makes a good argument for this, we basically ate whatever our mothers fed us, and that was our diet. And then only until recently, with the information age, are we starting to explore other foods. And so our line has been a matriarchal line passed on through the lineage of grandmothers and mothers for a very long time. And I find this fascinating because this will be the biggest gap that we cover here. There's 1.9 million years of unknown cooking that happened. We don't know what happened. We started learning about recipes, or we started writing down recipes only about 8,000 years ago or so. The oldest recipe, I think a lot of foragers here will find intriguing, is a nettle pudding recipe that was found in the last research was own recipe. And it starts to accelerate, you know, as we get further into civilizations, into empires, we start seeing more and more of the cookbooks that actually tried to capture what we had learned about food, or what we'd like to pass on to food, that wasn't just learning from watching your grandmother over the fire or watching your mother over the fire. I find it interesting that, you know, I put this, the first modern cookbook is a Roman cookbook, and recently have been hanging out with more indigenous folks in Mexico, and realizing even my own thinking, how Romanized my idea is. Like, this has to be the first, right? This is the first cookbook. It's the first cookbook that we've highlighted, I think. In Baghdad, there was a collection of 600 recipes at 900 AD, and the next book, the Yin Shen Zing Yao, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, is actually one of the most incredible writings that I've seen some of it. It was written by a Turkmenistan member of the Mongol Chinese Empire at the time, and had something like 1,300 pages of nutrition and medicine, and not Chinese food, which is sort of the first fusion cookbook, if you will. And then in medieval Europe, we started seeing a lot of men writing cookbooks, and it sounds like, for the most part, they were stealing the workers in the kitchen, often women, recipes, and then taking credit for themselves. So looking into that, how have mushrooms played into cooking literature? Well, in that early book, the book in China that I talked about, there's a lot of mushrooms talked about as medicine, because there was very little separation of food and medicine. But in the West, mushrooms were kind of, at least with the Greek heritage, they were considered damp and not good for the constitution, and they were very rarely talked about in cookbooks. It wasn't really until the industrial age that mushrooms started entering into cooking literature. And as far as we know, the very first book on only mushroom recipes was written in 1899. It's called 100 Mushroom Recipes. And in celebration of that, in 1999, Fred Kelso, who I believe is an East Coast mushroom guy, wrote For the Love of Fungus. And I haven't been able to find this anywhere in print. You can find it online. It's a 100-year bibliography of every mushroom cookbook that he was able to find. Fascinating. And what really happened is, in post-World War II, the information age, the images, the color television, the things started coming in. All of a sudden, people got interest in the natural world. And since that was a lot of the time that the mycology groups were formed, and a lot of them started creating their own cookbooks and their own sort of like internal stuff. And that's when mushrooms really started to sort of get I guess, their mycelial root. And I think just in the last 5 years, maybe in the last 2 years, mushrooms have just exploded above ground. Everyone is commenting on mushrooms these days. I wear a mushroom hoodie. I've had it for 5 years. This year, everyone's like, that hoodie's really cool, that's new. I'm amazed at how many people are diving into it through microdosing, through the psychedelic experience, through culinary experience, through being able to cultivate or semi-cultivate wild mushrooms by treating a part of their lands with spores or with the spore water. It's very fascinating. I just wanted to throw in also the Wild Mushrooms by Trent and Kristen. They were kind enough to include me in that book, and I feel really blessed for that. And I'll talk a little bit more about Trent here in a bit. So as a chef, I come from, and especially as a chef that's into science, I come from a heritage of some really incredible cookbooks. And these are all cookbooks that I'd highly recommend that you have on your shelf. They are phenomenal. And I'll go through them one by one. We can talk a little bit more about them. But these cookbooks are some of what I would consider the tomes of modern cooking. So On Food and Cooking actually first came out in 1984. It was the first food science cookbook for home cooks. It's a phenomenal book. It really is entertaining. You can read each section separately. It's not like a story. It has etymology. It has fun stories and histories and neat little blurbs. And mushrooms get 6 pages out of the entire book. They are in a survey of common vegetables, and have a disclaimer. Mushrooms and their relatives are not true plants. They're false plants, right? I find this fascinating because Harold McGee he reports with such authority on every other aspect of science. Yet, for some reason, doesn't really touch mushrooms at all. It does have some pretty good general information, and it was the first place that indicated that enzyme activity could change the flavor of a mushroom. If you soak a mushroom in water and then let it sit for several hours or a day, it actually does start to break itself down, and that does change or develop the flavors. That's really interesting. That would have been an amazing topic to cover for the next 12 pages. He doesn't touch it. And then he has very specific writings about mushrooms, and it's truffles, huitlacoche, and corn, which I think is gone at this point. I don't know if corn is still around. I guess that was a fungus-based vegan meat product. But yeah, there's not a lot of information in this book on fungi, whereas there's information on literally every other thing you can imagine in the cooking sphere. In the cooking sphere. In 2008, the Flavor Bible came out. This was a really cool survey of some of the top chefs in America, and looking at both their cookbooks and through interviews, they statistically analyzed the recipes of all these chefs. And from the times that ingredients would appear together with other ingredients, they put together an encyclopedia of how to pair what food with what. And it's alphabetical. So you can go in there and you can look up any ingredient you want, and it will tell you a list, and it gives you a little key of, you know, which foods were used more often by the chefs, you know, bolding or capitalizations. It's very, very cool. And this book, actually, of all the books I showed you on the last list, has the most mushroom specific information of any book that I've found that isn't specifically a mushroom cookbook. And as you can see, they have 4 wild mushrooms and 4 cultivated mushrooms. So 8 mushrooms in here, which is, yeah, as I said, this is the most, believe it or not, this is the most mention of species specific mushrooms in a cookbook. And it's really quite good, but it doesn't really go into the science or the whys. It sort of just says, here's what other people are doing. Now, modernist cuisine. This isn't a cookbook a lot of people have necessarily seen, but if you get a chance to even find the PDF of this book, it is hands down the most comprehensive cookbook that's probably been produced. It does lean towards modernist cooking, and if you're probably familiar with some degree, but this is the cooking of foams and chemicals and gels and starches and all kinds of really interesting breakdown. I mean, it breaks the chemistry down of what to do, how to cook, how to create this texture with that, how to, it's incredibly detailed. Not a single thing on mushrooms. There's a picture, which I think I have in the talk, of mushrooms being sauteed in a pan. Other than that, literally not a single mention of mushrooms. And this book is probably 5,000 pages long. It's insane. No mushrooms at all, as if mushroom science or mushroom cooking science is irrelevant. That's fascinating. And then J. Kenji Lopez Alt, he is the editor-in-chief of Serious Eats, fantastic food writer, really amazing. If you need any recipe ever, you can Google the name of the recipe, type in Serious Eats, and almost certainly not only will I have that, but I have the scientific explanation of why the recipe works, what's been tweaked. He comes from the America's Test Kitchen and started his own thing. It's a little more millennial based. So him in his book, mushrooms are included in chapter 4, blanching, searing, braising, glazing, roasting, and the science of vegetables. Barely mentions any various mushroom species at all. And specific mention of mushrooms, he's very proudly debunks that in the idea that washing creminis causes them, get this, washing creminis causes them to take on water weight, and therefore they lose flavor. That's the only, it's just that. Now, there's a lot of things that I could tell you that washing mushrooms do. Taking on water weight was not my concern, but he spends a whole couple pages debunking this idea. And that's it, just creminis. To me, that exposes this overarching bias that a lot of folks have, and somehow chefs still have this, even though they love porcini or they love chanterelles, that all mushrooms are the same. And so because they're a vegetable of all the vegetables, therefore they can all be treated in the same way. Most recently of the books I found fascinating, this Flavor Matrix by James Briscioni. He actually partnered with Watson, who peeled through the data of volatile chemicals and explored what's called flavor pairing theory. And flavor pairing theory says that if two foods share the same chemicals that our mouth can detect, in our minds, they go together. You know, think like the ratatouille experience where you're like, oh, you have this here and you have this here. They're great on their own, but when you put them in your mouth, something magical happens. This explores that using the Watson supercomputer, basically. There's no specific mention of mushroom species, which is interesting. And they look at mushroom as one single page, one single entity, which is really, really fascinating because I can tell you blindfolded a difference between chanterelle and a porcini. So how can it be that mushroom somehow represents the entirety of the mushroom pantheon? And this is, there you go, there's your flavor pair, everything here, it's all there. It's not there. It's completely devoid of any sort of nuance when it comes to fungi, which is unbelievable. Why is this? You know, why? You know, how is it that people that have gone into such detail with science have completely forgotten that this entire kingdom exists? And you know, Paul Stamets talks about the irrational fear of mushrooms, and apparently, you know, as I was looking into this, you know, and creating this talk, apparently it's more pervasive than we had accounted for. People literally just don't see that the mushrooms aren't there. They don't even notice, which is totally strange. So looking into the modernization of the kitchen gives us an idea of where we've come with the science of cooking. We started on stones, hearths, and iron. Right. This is the kitchen of the old French palaces. I think this was recreated in Versailles. And as you can see, it's very rough. It's very industrial. It was a dirty, sooty place. As the French culinary world started taking off, the Michelin star, the Michelin book came out. Every year, the cooks started getting more recognition. Commercial kitchens started getting worked on a little bit more. Nowadays, the kitchens are starting to get really shiny and polished. And you know, the most recent, now people actually give tours of their kitchens, right? So the kitchen is no longer the thing in the back. Now the kitchen becomes, you know, behind glass. You want to see the people working in what is almost a laboratory. And in the making of the modernist cuisine is a laboratory. The modern kitchen has centrifuges and vacuum purgers and like everything you would find in a modern like lab itself, but they're making these dishes that they're serving in, you know, $600 price fixed meals, which is mind-blowing in itself. And it's the lab itself that made the modernist cuisine. And this is out of that book. This is literally, the entire book looks like this. It's like a DK book meets the most scientific explanation of anything. It literally uses a laser to cut apart every single appliance that you use in the kitchen, and then describe what it all does, how it works. They do this with the microwave, with the crock pot, with the, I mean, it's literally everything. It's incredible, really, really fascinating. Like, if you want to know about food and cooking and what's going on, there's no better guide that literally tells you how all of this worked, the history and the science of how it was developed. And that's important because when we talk about mushrooms and we talk about especially eating and cooking mushrooms, it's about our experience with them. You know, it isn't just, well, you can just, here's the science of it and that's it. You know, it's the idea of flavor is every part of our sensory system. You know, as we sit down to a meal, the sight, the smells, even the warmth of it, you know, as it says here, the crunch of something, you know, who doesn't like crunching into a really crunchy potato chip? All of that combined together becomes the flavor. And so in some senses, you can't separate the science from the human. It's an intrinsically important part of how we interact with our food. So what is the new science of cooking mushrooms? That's what I would like to elucidate, and that's what I'm exploring on my own. One place that this has been explored a ton is in Japan, specifically on umami. And umami is considered the fifth flavor, the fifth taste, I'm sorry. After salty, sour, bitter, and sweet, umami is a it's the Japanese word that means a brothy, satisfying experience, basically a brothy, satisfying flavor. And that, it turns out that's exactly what umami is. Umami has significant research. It was around the turn of the Japanese scientists first isolated MSG from seaweed and found that it added to any foods, made that food more palatable. And it was actually his goal, this is the irony, Michael Pollan points this out in Omnivore's Dilemma, his goal was to make vegetables more palatable for children. So you can put MSG on broccoli, and now broccoli is like, oh, I want to eat more of that. Well, the food industry didn't get that memo, so they're putting MSG in otherwise unpalatable cardboard, and people are, eating them for breakfast, Doritos for breakfast. Umami is actually detected by the tongue by the presence of 3 molecules: the glutamate, which is as MSG, guanylate, and inosinate. The last one, inosinate, is more from fish. And guanylate is actually specifically in mushrooms. Now, what is it that we're detecting? Because this is actually really key. What we're detecting is aminos. These are broken pieces of RNA and broken amino acids, which let us know that the foods we're eating contain protein. So just like the sweet taste, when we taste something sweet, that actually lets us know that it has calories, that it has sugars, that it has something we can store for later. Well, the presence of umami gives proto-humans that there is protein in this food. It tastes good. I need this. Now, this is when the rubber hits the road to me. So guanylate is only found in dried mushrooms, and specifically in maitakes and shiitakes expressly. But it actually can be enhanced by handling how the mushroom is treated after it's been dried. So and I referenced this in Harold McGee's book, he indicates that by treating the mushrooms differently, the enzymes actually cause the development of flavors. This is fascinating because if you can hold a mushroom at a certain temperature for a certain length of time, you increase umami, you increase the desirability of your food. Where else is this molecule specific information useful to cook accurately? We're talking about, if we talk about the breakdown of science of every aspect of cooking, which is kind of what I was showing that has happened in the culinary world, this can be applied to mushrooms, but it hasn't yet. So I'm fascinated by what comes next. This is actually from umamiinfo.org. There's actually an entire institute studying umami, showing how the fresh and dried mushrooms increase in their properties of umami. And so dried dried shiitakes and seaweed soaked overnight in a room temperature water create the basis for Japanese dashi. And dashi is the broth that's then used for sauces, for miso soups, because it concentrates umami. It brings that satisfying flavor to it. And as you can see, the glutamate increases from 70 milligrams to over 1,000 milligrams per 100 grams. That's a significant jump. And so by what other molecules, what else is in mushrooms that we can bring out? This is a new slide for you guys. I just put this in here. So part of what James Briscioni was looking at with the flavor matrix is flavor pairing. And this is a really cool map that purports to show how foods, how common the volatile chemicals in foods are shared with other foods. And as you can see, foods that you would imagine have a lot of the same principles. So you see fruits are all kind of bunched together. The alliums and the cabbages and the sulfur containing things are kind of bunched together. You can see spices are kind of bunched together. And then over here, you see this little pentagram down in the lower right corner of mushrooms. And, they're down there and they're not connected to anything else, which is nonsense. James Briscioni even points out that strawberries and mushrooms actually flavor pair together. I challenge anyone to try that. There's something that's in both strawberries and in mushrooms that when you eat them together, you'll be like, wow, that's strangely, bizarrely good. That actually does work together. But they're not. It's not indicated in this chart. Mushrooms are sort of like, we'll get to it later. I think the time is now. So where do mushrooms actually fit in to this experience? Well, as it turns out, there is a ton of science on the volatile and flavor properties of mushrooms. It just hasn't crossed that layperson border yet. Even more interestingly, it's not only done by machines, and the machine isolates the chemical and then it sends it to the human for the human to actually aesthetically describe that thing. So what does the molecule that makes cocoa smell like cocoa? It actually requires a human, and these are the super sniffers, the people that become our wine folks, our cheese makers, the coffee folks, and you'll note that coffee, cheese, wine, there's a massive flavor wheel looking at all the differences of what the different roasts and what that exists. Like, we even have a map and a framework for how to create that. James Briscioni even created it for mushrooms. So what are we waiting for? Like, can we get to that point, right? Because what we know is that mushroom volatiles exist, right? Chanterelles smell like chanterelles. The one in Thailand, the tiny little, what I call the Gulf tea chanterelle, you could smell it before you found it. And I found that's the same with black trumpets, some porcinis like that. The volatile chemical of a fresh mushroom, if you know what you're doing, you can search by your nose, which is amazing, right? But what is it? What happens to it when you cook it? Fresh mushroom versus a cooked mushroom certainly changes, right? What if you cook it slow and low versus cooking it rapid and hot? Does that change the volatile chemicals of this? Or do drying and or powdering change, the air exposure or the oxygenation of things? Does that change what happens? And then aging it, right? I've heard, and I'm happy to say I just found some 10-year-old porcinis in like some dank box as we were moving, that I've heard that if the longer you age the porcinis, the more certain flavors come out. Like, you can really, like, imagine a boutique restaurant that instead of like your 48-day aged steak has 15-year aged porcini sauce that comes from this is where we could go with mushrooms. And then there's solvent extractions, and that's a bit sciencey sounding, but I'm talking about fat, water, and alcohol, right? Which we use in the kitchen all the time. If you're sauteing your onions before you put them in your thing, you're actually using a fat solvent extraction to pull the volatile chemicals that are fat soluble into the oil before you cook the rest of your food. And the same with alcohols and tinctures. There are certain things that are alcohol soluble, and then there are certain things that are water soluble. And so what part of the volatile chemicals come out in each one, right? So truffle oil, obviously truffle comes out in oil, right? But matsutake actually comes out really good, it turns out, in vodka, as does chanterelles. I just made some chanterelle vodka. It got completely drank at our goodbye brunch on Sunday. But it was amazing. And it was just dried chanterelles. You're like, had too many chanterelles. What are you going to do with them? Don't dry them. Dried chanterelles don't amount to anything. Well, it turns out dried chanterelles in vodka bring back the chanterelle, and it's incredible. It is like some of the most beautiful flavors, everything that you want without the mushroomy behind it. Works amazing for cocktails. So with the solvent extractions, we again have to analyze the flavors and the sense of what brings to that. So I did find this is one of the studies I found, and it turns out the volatile extraction, or the volatile components, do change over time. And this was a French chanterelle study looking at basically just dehydration. It's pretty fascinating. Some of the volatile chemicals actually increase depending on the dehydration method, and others you can see the dehydration method completely ruins some of the volatile chemicals. They're just gone. And I think that's super fascinating. There is actually, the science is out there if you know A, how to look for it, and B, how to read this gibbly gobbledygook. And a lot of the reason is because perfumers and food chemists who are working in industrial food production are breaking things down to the volatile chemical components, and they're looking for ways to isolate that cocoa so they can add it to their chocolate Doritos with umami or whatever the hell they're making with their weird labs. So these studies do exist. So type in scholarly articles, mushroom volatiles, you'll find a whole bunch of really interesting things. So I wanted to go through shroom by shroom, take a little look at some of the things that I found interesting. Obviously there's so much more out there, but this just gives you a little idea of, where we're going. Now, I like to start with candy caps, because do you guys have candy caps on the East Coast? Is that a thing? Okay, awesome. So to me, this is the gateway for mushroom scents. This is the one where you put it in front of someone that has no idea what you're talking about, and you're like, that's a mushroom, and they're like, bullshit, pardon my French. The maple smell that just radiates out, and Chef Julie, Sonoma Chef Schaefer, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name right now. Anyway, Chef Julie has said that if you put your candy caps in, she likes rum, I prefer brandy. I've always strained mine out. She says you just leave it in there, add new brandy, and it redoes it all over again. It's like an endless font of candy cap flavor. And you can use it like vanilla flavoring in your desserts. I don't really like picking out pieces of candy cap from my desserts, so I use it as an alcohol solvent, and it works fantastic as an alcohol solvent in an alcohol extraction. Fascinating science here by Darwin de Cesar, and again showing that smell that we detect, it doesn't even happen until it hits the moisture in our nasal passages. Like the carbolactone 3 changes to sotalone on contact with our nasal passages. That water content actually, so it's literally the act of us changes the flavor into what we find desirable. I think that is so cool, and there's so much more to explore in that realm, right? So chanterelles, they have, at least in this particular paper, they'd found 15 volatile chemicals from the Sabarius and from the lutescens, 11 different volatile chemicals. My guess is there's a ton more. That French study actually had 39 chemicals, and maybe the French are into perfumes and they have more volatiles in their chanterelles, but I'd be surprised if there weren't tens more. But really fascinating, right? So if you isolate those compounds, you get green plant-like odor or a sweet wood-like fruity odor. Combine those two, and you get the apricot and plum flavor that's identified from common and golden chanterelles. That like fruity flavor is actually a combination of two different molecules that are nose hits at the same time. So we're already actually doing flavor pairing. It's just that the mushrooms give us a nice package to have them at the same time. This is actually a chart that I put together based on the data from that French study. And I just wanted to show, this is up on my Patreon account, and I'll talk about that at the end for my members. And it kind of breaks down the most common volatile chemicals. And I write this one down. This is cool. The Good Sense Company. You can actually look up any of the stuff on the left, like 1-octan, 3-ol. You can look that up on the Good Sense Company, which I think was developed for perfumers, candle makers, and it breaks down everything that you would never wanted to know about these volatile chemicals, and some really interesting things as well. But one of the things it does show is, look over in the pink, other food sources of this same volatile chemical. Now we're talking about flavor pairing theory. So two foods that share the same chemical can be paired together. So if these are all the foods, that contain each of these various chemicals that you find in mushrooms, why the heck is that pentagon on the food pairing map all isolated in the side? As it turns out, almost everything contains something that some other mushroom contains, which means we're opening up the realm of all kinds of amazing flavor pairing combinations, right? And this is actually, this goes on for 39 different chemicals. This is quite intricate. But the point is, we really have barely scratched the surface, and the information is out there already, which is really what's really cool. We don't actually have to reinvent the wheel, or in this case, reinvent the fire. It's there. We just have to put it into a way that makes sense for the sort of the emerging modern cook and also the emerging home cook. So my favorite mushroom, the Craterellus cornucopioides. There's 30 different identified compounds from this, and it turns out that limonene, accounted for almost 15% of the volatiles found in this mushroom. Now, limonene you might know from such foods as, I don't know, lemongrass or lemon verbena or lemon thyme. This is the main chemical that is, or the largest chemical found in this black trumpet, which is fascinating. And yet, again, why are they oscillated off to the side? Like they're not integrated with the other foods, as if they don't exist on the same planet somehow, but they completely do. So using citrus or using lemon or some of these lemon containing herbs with this, flavor pairing to heaven, right? In the yellow trumpets, also my favorite, they vie for the top spot, but only after it's been dried and rehydrated. 18 different volatile compounds were identified. And one of them that made up 15% of this one is lilac and hyacinth. So it's like a completely different experience than from the lemon or the limonene containing black trumpet. Amazing. Like what if there's 15% of it, that means you could extract it. That means it can be used industrially. That means it can be used maybe in your home if we know that it's alcohol solvent versus water solvent or fat solvent. We could make oils or tinctures that specifically pull out this particular flavors, right? And then in the boletes, 53 different identifiable compounds were found to make up the combination of the flavor of a porcini. But what was really interesting is they did actually study the changes of volatile chemicals for the shelf life of mushrooms, and it turns out it does change, it does shift. So storage temperature modifies the rate of changes, but it also, just the fact that it's got time, you have light, oxygen, and just time, and it actually starts changing from one flavor to another flavor. So again, looking at that boutique aging of mushrooms, like what temperature, what's the perfect mushroom aging room temperature, right? Like these are the kinds of restaurants that I expect are going to be coming out, probably start in New York and Shanghai. But we have a lot to explore with mushrooms and how they not just pair, but how they break down, how they change, and what makes them so special. Why does it, the entire thing is, why does a porcini taste like a porcini? That's what started all of this. I was like, why is it different than a chanterelle? Like, what is the thing? And now I can't stop. The snowball has started down the hill. So there's, as I said, there's a ton of information out there in scientific studies, and we've talked a little bit about the volatile chemicals, but it turns out there's also non-volatile flavor components of mushrooms as well. Mushroom sugars, starches and things that change the mouthfeel, just aspects of any of the umami technically is the physical properties. So beyond just the flavor, which is kind of what people get hung up on, there's also that experience that you have of actually having the mushrooms themselves. I wrote a little paper on the Termitomyces, which is fascinating. It has one of the highest absorbable protein contents of any mushroom, and also has some of the highest umami content of any mushroom, and is considered one of the most flavorful mushrooms that you can cook. And I have to say, the ones I had in Thailand were absolutely delicious, so I don't disagree with that. But again, what it means is the information is there. How do we parse it out and make it useful? And if we do need to repeat some experiments, is that something that we can do as lay people? Is that something that we can experiment with and share those findings with each other? Well, since I started giving this talk, this has happened. This came out in July of 2020. So there are people out there. This is developing a sensory flavor lexicon. How do we name those familiar smells that keep coming up, right? How do we, somebody pointed out, you really need to check and see how often this has been cited, if it actually stuck. But at least these guys are creating a way to discuss the flavors that come from different mushrooms and find a way to put them together. So I thought this was really fascinating. How do you characterize? And you can find all of these online. This is I do my search for scholarly articles, but really cool. I mean, it's happening, but it's happening in the lab. And I would like to encourage all the mushroom to start having in your own kitchen. Play with something, do something new, do something weird, right? So then there's cooking techniques. So Do the other techniques of cooking change the properties, flavor, or qualities, right? So pressure cooking. Now we're talking about something that can break down higher heat, right? So maybe heat beyond the boiling point. This might be, maybe we'll find it's the same thing as low temperature deep frying. We're getting 245, 265. Maybe we're looking at the same as that, but maybe it does change it. Dry cooking versus wet cooking. Everyone's like, oh, I only dry saute my chanterelles. My answer to that is no, you don't. You put them in a dry pan, and within 3 seconds, you're wet sauteing them because they release all their water. Now you're stuck with water physics, right? Then canned and stored. We see that dried porcinis change over time, but what about do mushrooms change over time? Aside from pickling, do mushrooms change over time when they're stored in liquid on the shelf? What about vacuum purging and sealing? Now, I'm fascinated by this. The toxic chemicals that exist in morels are supposedly airborne, especially in the gyrometrins. There are reports of chefs dying in the kitchen from inhaling the wrong morel that they were cooking as it was cooking, because it's releasing, rocket fuel, basically the hydrazines. So if you put something in a vacuum, does it get rid of that without cooking it? Is it possible to release some of these volatile chemicals from the physical mushrooms, break the cell walls, and maybe that gets rid of it? If you seal it in a bag and cook it, does it get rid of the chemical as well? Is it lysed by heat? Is it thermal lysing? Does it break the chemical down, or are you just trying to release it in the air? So these are things that we don't know yet, right? So the sous vide cooking technique, now you can do exactly 133 degrees Fahrenheit for, say 45 hours. What changes then? There's so many ways that we can go to explore how flavors, textures, how these things change over time. And then there's like the other culinary uses, which is really covered a lot in modern cuisine. So what other culinary chemicals? We think a lot about flavor, but I mentioned mouthfeel, right? So what about gels? Anyone that's cooked a large amount of porcinis can see that for a second there, before it reabsorbs the water, it releases this gooey, viscous, kind of slimy characteristic. What if you dehydrate that or reduce that? Does that now add a new property to other foods? Can you make foams out of it? Can you change? Can we find properties that are in mushrooms that can change the mouthfeel, change the textures of the foods on our plate? So what about starches? Mushroom carbohydrates. What kind of thickening power might they have if we were able to isolate them? Even their textures. Most of the people that I know that don't like mushrooms don't like the texture of mushrooms, which to me just says somebody cooked them for them wrong one time, and it's stuck in their head, and they really need a re-education. So start with candy caps. But yeah, different textures. What can we do to create a crispy edge on one side and a softer edge on the other side? I love contrasting things. I find lion's mane is a really amazing mushroom that you can crisp up on one side and it stays soft on the other side. I love that. Then colors, foragerchef.com, an amazing guy out of, I think he's in Minnesota. He actually turned me onto this idea by saying that lobster mushrooms, if you take off that outer layer and cook them in fat, you actually extract a saffron-like yellow into the fat. So there's a fat-soluble compound of something that can change the colors of the food you're doing. If we can come up with mushroom food dyes, then perhaps we can get rid of these chemical food dyes. And on that note, and this is what I should have added, I have done something since the last talk. I've been baking no knead bread, Jim Leahy's New York Times, definitely look it up. And I've been replacing a small amount of the flour with my porcini powder, and then pretending that it's part of the flour. That bread tasted like wheat checks. On a higher concentrations of mushroom, it tasted like rye. It was as dark as pumpernickel. It affected, as far as I can tell, nothing in the rising, nothing in that, except that the moisture that it held was almost more like banana bread in some senses than it was like French bread. The crumb was small. Highly recommend. Find an easy bread recipe and take 50 milligrams or take 50 grams of flour out, put 50 grams of mushroom powder in, see what happens. Because that was a really cool experiment. Really happy I did that. I'll send the recipes actually after this talk to you guys so you can see what I was doing with that. And then of course the flavors. What does if flavor pairing says that we can unlock new experiences based on something, can we create like a series of bridges, you know, where you're like, eat this, then eat this, then eat this, then eat this, and all of a sudden you've got this rainbow palette, you know, in your face that changes the whole experience of mushrooms, right? So as you can tell, I'm very excited about this. And I got a chance recently, and this Trent, Blizzard, and I were actually going to be doing some demos at the San Francisco Mycological Fair and the Sonoma Mushroom Camp. And if you haven't heard of the Soma Mushroom Camp, which happens Martin Luther King weekend, usually second or third weekend in January, every year in Sonoma, because it is one of the most awesome experiences. I think it's like $400 for the full weekend, and it's talks and forays and cooking and camaraderie, or as they call it, convivial hobnobbing. And so Trent and I were going to do some experiments, and I suggested that I wanted to play with freeze-dried mushrooms. I haven't really played with these too much. As it turns out, everything was canceled, but Trent was kind enough to send me the freeze-dried mushrooms anyway. And what you're looking at here is actually the same starting weight, the powder in the center there at the top, and the lobster mushrooms that are now rehydrated on the cutting board were the same starting weight of freeze-dried lobster mushrooms. And I wanted to make my clam-free clam chowder, which is basically replacing the clams in a clam chowder. I'll also send you the recipe for this afterward that you can distribute to the membership. I wanted to make that with these freeze-dried mushrooms, but I thought, what if I replaced the flour in the roux with lobster mushroom flour instead? I ended up not fully replacing it. I did use some flour as well, so I'm not sure it's a full gluten replacement yet. Holy moly, the second that lobster mushroom powder hit the butter to make the roux, the entire house smelled like seafood. It was one of the coolest experiments. So highly recommend that, because the powder of freeze-dried mushrooms is more like flour or starch. It's not like if you put your dried mushrooms in a blender, it's completely different than that. And I think there may be some really cool applications. If freeze-dried machines weren't so expensive, I'd have one already. But this is definitely something that I want to explore moving forward. And I was really lucky. In the green is my buddy Matt. He goes by Mushpocalypse on Instagram. He's a mushroom grower and a filmmaker, and he brought over his equipment, and we actually did a short video of me making this. So I haven't seen the edits yet, but it should be really fun. This is my fiance Kim there on the right. So that was a really fun experience, and I assume there'll be some kind of video coming in the near future. Now, beyond that, these volatile chemicals that we were talking about earlier, it turns out that those chemicals are not just for flavor. They also have medicinal properties and antioxidant properties and antibacterial properties and some antiviral properties, believe it or not. So, as this says here, odorant volatile compounds from, it says medicinal mushrooms, they actually are talking about edible mushrooms, remain an essentially untapped source for future medicines. Like we haven't even looked at all the different compounds that come out of the mushrooms and what they can do, and Paul does this a little bit Paul Stamets does this a little bit following his track on the conch, on the conchs and what they do for antiviral stuff, which is fascinating. But it may turn out, that 15-year aged porcini produces something that's unknown to medicine. We don't know. Like there's so much more to think about. Let thy food be thy medicine. But in this case, let your scientific inquiry bring an intrigue in that allows us to find new things that we haven't even conceived of yet, right? So we've talked a lot about specific mushrooms. And I want to bring this back to the kingdom of fungi and the third culinary kingdom, because it was pointed out to me at Soma after I've given this talk, and I'm like, all these different things, and the mushroom section in the cookbook would be great. It'll be all the different mushrooms. Someone's like, well, what about all the other fungi? And I was like, oh my God, that's so true. As it turns out, like mycelium in the ground, fungi have been in our cookbooks this entire time. in breads, in cheeses, in winemaking, all through the pages, spread out, invisible to us. And so coaxing out of that, the third culinary kingdom, it's not just the different species of mushrooms that we enjoy during the season. It's actually, we use fungus all the time in our cooking. I found this paper for my QED. There's a whole kingdom to thank for more than just mushrooms, you know, from bread, wine, mezcal, tempeh, soy sauce, miso, marmite, beer, cheese, pickles, salamis. We use fungi all the time in our cooking and in across almost every culture. And yet somehow we haven't quite figured out how to coax that out of our current culinary. So in this review of culinary literature, past, present, and future, I think that it's time to really start thinking about how to give mushrooms the rightful place in the cooking pantheon. And why is that important? It's important because it changes the entire viewpoint of our ecological system. When you start realizing that you can't grow a chanterelle, you have to find them, that you want to start saving the forest more. Or when you find out that there's a particular medicine in an aged porcini, you know, that changes the calculus. It changes the way that we look at our natural world by recognizing them, not just in the scientific world, not just in the medicinal world, but actually in food, and realizing that just as there's meat and just as there's veggies, you know, fungi are incredibly important, not only to what we've done in the past and what we're doing now, but what we're going to do in the future. And so that's as passionate argument I can give to erecting the third culinary kingdom. I did want to talk about a few things that I've been up to. This was my coffee camp.
Hey,
this
Zachary,
was my first mushroom camp.
Sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
but I just want to let you know that we're 5 minutes to the normal end of our meeting, and we do have questions.
Okay, I'll go real fast.
Do you
How's
think
that sound?
we can run over as long as you're okay running over? But I do
yeah,
acknowledge
fine.
that we're in
Yeah.
DC, and some people probably want to go watch the
Sure.
So,
That's true.
heads up, everyone, that it's almost 9.
Okay, I will go. This is the last 3 slides. I just want to talk about a little bit what I'm up to outside of giving this passionate talk. In October, I did lead my first mushroom camp based on sort of cooking. And from that, I've come up with a lot of ideas that I'm really excited. And I'm so happy, April, that I caught your presentation, because what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking of for the Institute of Mycophagy, outside of even the book, really was sprung coming out of this camp. I am leading with my partner 2 tours to Mexico. I'm actually in Alyssa Allen's house right now in Seattle, on our way up to Bellingham, on our way to Mexico for some reason. We're driving to Mexico right now, but we had to go to Seattle, the passport agency, and Alyssa was kind enough to let me present out of her talk today. Alyssa is coming with us. We hang out with the Zapotecs. We do mushroom dyeing, weaving, foraging, cooking. Alan Rockefeller has been our dude for the last couple tours. These are really fun. I think I have 2 spots left on the second tour. The first one is sold out. So if you're interested in this, hit me up immediately and we can talk about that. And if there's a lot of interest, we can talk about making a more specific tour for certain clubs. Lastly, as was mentioned earlier, this is my Patreon page. I have to admit, I am not really posting any new information to this. It's not a format that was really helpful to me. I am switching over towards more of the YouTube and video stuff. So please go and check it out. There's 2 years of posts and really cool information on there. But it is less, I'm less interacting with that. And that's the end. So I will gladly take questions. And then I did want to do a quick pitch that I kind of prompted April with, which is I was just brought on to the NAMA Culinary Committee. Chef Julie is the chair of that. And as it turns out, there's barely ever been a NAMA Culinary Committee. We're in new territory and we've been given the green light to basically do whatever we want on that. And I would love to put that out there. We're recruiting new people that want to come and get involved in that. It is a brand new thing. None of the old folks are there. Trent Blizzard has taken over as the president of NAMA, and in his wake has followed a whole bunch of young, really interested, passionate people that want to change it and turn it into something that is useful for members, but also for everyone. So that's really exciting. So if you're interested more specifically in culinary and North America, also hit me up, because I can speak for the committee now, which is really exciting. So far it's me, Julie, Eugenia Bone, and this really wonderful woman out of LA. And that's it. That's it. We're the committee. So we need some Midwesterners. We need some more East Coasters. And I'll take questions from there.
Great. Thank you, Zachary. This was amazing. It's interesting to hear you talk about something scientifically that I think some of us experience, but without kind of understanding the science behind it. Like, you know, a lot of people were talking about the dried candy caps and just how the flavor gets more concentrated, and dive into other people's questions. But one of the questions I was having as I was listening to you is, you know, with all of these different combinations of volatile compounds in particular mushrooms, you know, what generally is the understanding of how and why particular mushrooms develop those specific compounds?
I mean, I feel like that's probably an entire different PhD. I mean, to be clear, everything that we eat has a huge suite of volatile compounds. So an orange has all of that. Thyme has, you know, the herb thyme has a whole bunch of different volatile compounds as well. So it's not just that mushrooms has a huge swath of volatile compounds. I would imagine most volatiles were developed for defense. Volatile, you know, the toxic to smaller creatures. Which is why if you've ever accidentally taken oregano essential oil and put it in your mouth, it burns. It's a lot. And so these volatile compounds, I would assume, are probably similarly developed to either attract sporulating pests, or not pests, sporulating things that come and bring the spores, similar to stinkhorns, although not something we necessarily want, or they're to deter things. They're clearly not trying to bring mates around. So yeah, no, that's fascinating. I'm not sure the why is a little outside of my purview. It's like I want to know the how, you know.
Yeah.
But that's a good question, you know. I hope future folks look into that.
Well, I'll just drill through some of these questions. They're a little bit all over the place. One person wanted to know about using mycelium for cooking.
So I've heard that, you know, the general theory is that mycelium, the entire body of the mushroom, except for the basidia, are mycelium. The gills themselves have their own special kind of thing, but generally the entire mushroom is mycelium and isn't in really any different from the mycelium that's under the ground, just concentrated and super dense, right? If that is the case, and I've heard that somebody has grown, you know, you can cultivate morel mycelium, right? So that's fantastic, but you can't really get the mushrooms themselves to grow. But if you grow that on a completely edible substrate and cut that up, is the mycelium morel flavored? Like, can you get morel powder without ever actually growing a morel itself?
Right.
I think that's really interesting. I think that, you know, Paul Stamets does that for medicinal mushrooms, right? So there's lion's mane mycelium is in some of the compounds or the dried powders that go out. So I would imagine you can do it with edible mushrooms. And that, as soon as I get a lab to grow stuff in, I'm going to try that, which actually I have one waiting for me in Oaxaca right now. So I'm very excited to get down there and start growing my own mushrooms and experiment with this stuff.
Another person wanted to know if there are any mushroom fermentation methods or types of mushrooms, I guess, that you would recommend outside of chaga kombucha. The common chaga kombucha, I have not found that to be common. I've never had that, but
yeah, right. Wow. Well, we don't have much chaga on the West Coast, so that is an East Coast mushroom. So I haven't specifically seen chaga kombucha, but it sounds like it would be good. So in terms of fermentations, does that mean like mushroom pickles, like using lactofermentation to ferment mushrooms, or is that using mushrooms?
I think more generally speaking, whatever. I mean, I guess there's lots of different ways you could
Yeah.
ferment mushrooms. So
Yeah, I mean, I think the russulas are often lacto fermented quite
Mhm.
quite frequently. Mainly because you can soak them forever and they don't stop being crispy. I think that's one of the main things. I have pickled shiitakes before, which I find delicious. I did tarragon and lavender in my shiitake pickles. It's really tasty. In San Francisco, and I'm gonna butcher their names. I won't remember their names, but the heck is there's for koji. Is anyone familiar with koji as a fungi? So koji is what they use to start sake, tempeh. It's used for making garums, which is actually like, yeah, there you go, sake for up in the front. And what's fascinating about koji is you actually grow it first on rice, and then you dry that and you powder it, and then you can use it to break down starches. But
Mhm.
what's interesting about it is if you do the initial ferment of rice at the 3 different temperatures, it will either produce amylase, which breaks down starches, protease, which breaks down proteins, or lipase, which breaks down fats, depending on the first part of it. And then you dry that, and then you can use that to make, say, liquid aminos out of meats. Like using garums, you can take meat and reduce it to liquid, like fish sauce. Or if you want to break down fats, like say you're making salamis, and you want to break down some of those fats, you actually change the way that you initially ferment the koji, and it changes the chemicals that it makes that will then be useful to you later in food. So I find that's when you say mushrooms and fermentation, the first thing that comes to mind is koji. I think it's Shared Cultures, I believe, is the lady out of San Francisco doing it. I'm going to send a follow-up email to y'all, and you can pass it on to the group, and I will find all that information.
The Noma book has a lot of great
Yes,
stuff on koji and
over the top.
Cats also.
Yeah, really amazing
Book also.
Yeah.
A few people are curious about the historical use of mushrooms by Native Americans in traditional cuisine, particularly given that that's, the species that we find here are going to be species that were available to the Native peoples here.
Sure. What was the question? Is there research about what they use?
It's just, I think, generally speaking, sort of, to what extent mushrooms were part of native diets, and if you know anything about the preparation methods or species that were used.
I know less about that in this continent as I do in Thailand, actually, because I spent a good year and a half there during the pandemic, and they, generally they boil just about everything, and a lot of the traditional methods are the same. They make broths out of them. Robert Rogers, who wrote The Fungal Pharmacy, if anyone is out of Edmonton, BC, is a phenomenal human being, and his book is fascinating. He has a number of Native American names for mushrooms in that book, which to me, if there's named, it's probably that they have uses. And then I'm not sure, I've yet to read there's a cookbook that came out called The Sous Chef, which is S-I-O-U-X.
Someone mentioned that in the chat, yeah.
I'm not sure if that has mushroom specific stuff in it or not, but that would be a great place to start. And I have some of my friends, one of my friends just was in Santa Fe. She's an indigenous clothing designer. And she was there for the first ever opening of the 100% native owned gallery in Santa Fe. This blew my mind. I mean, I think we're just getting started to actually have this interest where people are like, well, wait, what have you done with this? And, like, it's sort of like mushrooms, like in this continent, at least, or at least I should say in the top 2/3 of this continent. Right. We have really given very little credit, and we all but wiped out the history of the folks that were here before, and it's really unfortunate. Now, NAMA is really interested right now in bringing on that lower third of the continent because they have nobody in Mexico currently, and I think it's going to be pretty eye-opening because they aren't like interested groups that are going out foraging together. They're sustenance hunting, and they're controlling their lands and they're mapping it. And I think it's going to be a different. I think it's going to be great to actually include all of North America in NAMA. And I'm looking forward to being one of the liaisons to go down there. But you know, that's very old traditions. And there's actually a paper which I will try to include the link as well that talks about 36 mushrooms that the indigenous in Ixtlan, which is the Zapotec people, have been using since forever. And there's several mushrooms that we have passed up all the time while we walk and we go get our Crater Ellis that they eat. So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn, and I think that we will have to keep diving in. You know, I'm usually on this side on the future side of science, and I would love to partner with someone who wants to get into the anthropology of food, and especially the anthropology of mushrooms as food. I think that would be really great. So if anyone knows anyone, please put them in touch with me. That would be great.
Okay, time for a couple more. Do you have time for a couple more?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Someone wanted to know if frozen mushrooms retain most of their nutritional value compared to fresh.
Well, there's the theory that you can't actually access their nutrition until you cook them, right? That the chitin, while the chitin in the cell walls actually prevents us from absorbing the nutrients, and that's why we have to cook mushrooms and why you shouldn't eat mushrooms raw. I've eaten lots of raw psilocybes. I can tell you that that doesn't stop the chemicals from getting out of the cells. So I'm not sure if that really is a truism or not. But you know, some of the things that are developed as you cook them down, I don't know that you lose vitamins and minerals like you do with plants. That's actually a really interesting. That's an interesting question as well. Again, how do we study these things? And perhaps I should put this up there. So I have been morphing from wanting to write this book into actually creating an institute. And I'm happy to be in Alyssa's house because I'm so fascinated by the dyeing community, the mushroom dyers community, because they always have this really cool lab where they're in there every day at the events, and they're like coming out and they come out with this book of every year of all the dyes they've made from all the different mushrooms, and they log it all. You can go through the various years. We should have something like that for food, you know, where like regular, like what you were showing, like where regular people can upload information or upload valuable new ways of doing something, and it can get logged and noted. And so I was just over the moon to see you sort of report on a portal for people to put this stuff, because that's really what I would like to see happen all over the world. But you know, for now, focus on North America. Like, how does somebody who's playing with who has a freeze dryer get it to people that want to play with freeze dried mushrooms? Or how, you know, what does that look like so it's not lost? And maybe it's the passion of the fiber or the passion of the psychedelic world that gets these really incredible, diverse groups of people together to talk about things. And I haven't seen that much in culinary yet, but I think we're on that edge. You know, I think we're right there where home cooks can actually access equipment now for cheaper. We can really play with things, and we can build on what we're learning from each other. That's my hope. Yeah.
And unlike, you know, I mean, you show sort of the history of these cookbooks where it's like mushrooms are a footnote at best. It's like so many times I've gone online to try to find information about a specific mushroom, and Alan Berger's site is great. We were going to have him, and then he ended up not being available. But
he's quite popular right now.
Yeah, well, he has, you know, recipes out there on mushrooms that other people don't bother talking about per se.
Right.
But
no,
yeah, there's a dearth of information, at least, you know, online about you know, the myriad mushrooms that are edible, that aren't the like top 10 things that you know hear about again and again, and so many, you know.
But there's no authority on it. That's the problem. You know, it's like we know from experimentation or from our experience that Alan Berger or Chad Hyatt have some experience in doing that, and we know that they're the experts. But you could just as well find some other blog that's telling you to put morels in your salad, and if you don't know, like, and you're putting raw mushroom, you're putting raw morels in something like that, somebody could say like, it sounds like it's authoritative. So how do we create this database that people can like rest assured that no, this is actual, you know, even if it's anecdotal, it could say, or if it's scientific, it could say. So I would like to see that starting to come about, and that's what I've.
And I know
proposed.
with Eugenia Bone, with, you know, the fantastic fungi cookbook, that was, you know,
Mhm.
part of the ethos of that was like, you know, a community
Right,
base.
exactly. Right. Yeah, what did she had a name? She had a name for that cookbook. She was like, we won't really review those books where you just collect things. We want to review the new cookbooks. So the NAMA committee is going to be reviewing the new cookbooks that come out too with mushrooms. So I'm just sort of like catching up to what we know about mushrooms in the culinary world as a general, you know, generally. So yeah, I think a lot's going to happen in this next year, in the next couple of years, because mushrooms are taking off. I don't know if anyone's researched the Fungi Foundation out of Chile, but they're doing so much for teaching folks all over the world to grow. It's really taking off right now, and it's really exciting to see it posted everywhere on Instagram, and new mushroom fabrics and mushroom clothes and mushroom this. And there was an entire mushroom festival that happened in Mexico that was based, it was like mycelium was the theme. It was all about connecting, and you know, so they're in the zeitgeist now.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you heard at the beginning, you know, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, that's a huge festival on the mall every year here. You know, they approached us excitedly for this Earth optimism theme that they have going, wanting to
Cool.
incorporate mushrooms into that. So we're talking
Yeah.
about Alyssa actually coming and,
Amazing.
you know, I have a good chef friend here that we're
Yeah.
trying to bring in to do culinary demos. So yeah, it's
Amazing. Yeah, really exciting. Yeah, I look forward to being able to tour again.
I think this is probably a good
Yeah.
place to wrap up. This has been fantastic. So thank you.